Hi, my name is Bill Pollack, and we're at the Peterson Museum in Los Angeles. It's early April in 2001, and this is part of the program to put together an archival of racing figures and personalities from the early 50s. And I have as our guest today, Cy Yedor. Cy?
Thank you, Bill. We both had a lot of fun in those days, and looking back, it was probably one of the best times of my life, the 1952 to 1958, when we were running sports cars. And strangely enough, last weekend, just yesterday, I was at Laguna Seca, and my son is now racing. And just wandering around Laguna Seca, seeing all the cars, and remembering some of these same cars that I raced against were there. And people asked me actually, did you race vintage sports cars? I said, no, only when they were new.
I love it.
And I think that's the same with Bill. They were all brand new cars when we were racing them. And we'd race them for a year or two and have a problem, blow an engine, or something quicker would come that we'd want. And we'd get $2,000 or $3,000 for those cars. And today those cars are worth in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. But it just brings back a lot of good memories, especially being at Laguna Seca, because my first race was at Palm Springs. And I raced my brother's Jaguar XK 120.
When was that, Cy?
In 1952. And we were having dinner at the Chi-Chi Club, I remember. My wife and I and family, and I went out and was walking down Palm Canyon, and there was a Buick dealership there, and they were little sports cars all over the place. They were teching them and putting numbers on them and taping up windshields and headlights, and I wandered in and said, what are you guys doing here? And they said, well, we have a race at the airport. I had no idea in the world that they were racing in Palm Springs. And I went back to the restaurant, got my brother's Jaguar keys. He says, what are you doing? I said, I'll show you later. And we went out to the track. They helped me put seat belts in the car. And I actually borrowed a crash helmet from Josie von Neumann. And we didn't have any racing suits in those days. You raced in a pair of tennis shoes and Levi's and a t-shirt. So there was no suit to worry about. And lined up in the pit area, I had the tool roll out of the Jaguar and a quart of oil that came out of the trunk of the car, and that was our pit. And I started at the back of the pack because I was a novice and had never run with those people before, or had never run anything, actually. And Al Torres was the starter. And he dropped the flag, and I was about third out of about 25 cars at the first corner. I thought, this is a snap, and went right straight off the first corner. Had no chance to make that first corner. And that was my introduction to racing sports cars.
That's great.
And my brother had said to me, you wrecked my car, you own it. So I dinged it up a little bit. And he said, okay, it's your car. And he stopped that day on the way home at Peter Satori and bought a new gull wing, which I half paid for. But that's the way we started. And then I decided I should learn about what we're doing. And I bought a little MGTC, and I started to make a race car out of it. Emil Diet in Culver City had a shop there. And he helped me. And we just reconned the car, took the fenders off, took the windshield off, took the seats out, put one seat in that was light, and put some sickle fenders on it. And about that time, there was a MG dealership in Culver City called Rabuzzi Motors. And they had a mechanic there by the name of Bud Hand. And I hooked up with Bud, and we figured we'd go racing. So we took this little TC out and raced it a little bit. Then I realized that it just wasn't the car to have. So I was in San Francisco, and up at on Van Ness Boulevard at Shell Cavalli had a dealership there. And in the window was this little red envelope-bodied aluminum sports car that had belonged to Al Capel. So it was just an MGTC chassis with leaf springs in the front and a nice, pretty body, and it looked fast. So I wound up buying it and had some fun with it and raced it for about a year. Then we were at Pebble Beach in about 54. Yeah, 1954, on the old 17-mile drive. And it was just kind of a little get-together. There were not a lot of people, not a lot of entries. Bill was there. I remember one night, Bill and I took the Carson's Allard and drove it down Highway 1 to Nepenthe. Yeah. And had a couple of beers, and by the time we got back, it was about 3 in the morning by the time we got, and we had our own impromptu road race with one car up Highway 1.
That was pretty crazy.
Well, we were young. You know, we were all 22, 23 years old at the time. And bulletproof, and figured nothing could happen to anybody. Actually, I first started into cars with a Model A that I had in high school. It had a rear main bearing leak that was so bad we'd take a 5-pound coffee can and put it under the rear main when I parked it in the morning at school, and when I went get ready to go home, would take the oil out of the drip can and pour it back in the motor to have enough oil to get home. But then, you know, that's how we all got started with $75 cars. But getting back to the Capel MG, we were at Pebble Beach. I can't think of what year it was. It was 54, I believe. 53 or 54. And I was driving the Capel MG. And there were Oscars and Porsches, and Ken Miles had the R1 car. And the R1 blew up, and Ken was standing in the pit area. My car, on about the 5th lap, the clutch went, and I was shifting without the clutch for 8 or 10 laps, and then it started boiling and overheating. Steam coming up, you know, transmission was bubbling hot oil up on my feet. And I drove it for 4 or 5 more laps like that, and then I pulled in the pits, and Miles was standing there, and he says, "What's wrong, old boy?" I said, "Really, not much, Ken." You know, I said, "There's no clutch, and it's overheating, and the transmission's spitting oil all over my feet." And he said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Well, I've had enough." I said, "I'm going to park it." He says, "May I drive?" I said, "Sure, hop in." So Ken hopped in, we pushed him off, and he finished the race. And he didn't finish up in the points, but he did finish. And afterward he came in and he said, "Cy, that is the most dangerous bloody car I have ever driven." And with the little experience I had at the time, I didn't realize how bad it was. But he said, "I'm building a new car, and when my new car is finished, I'll let you have this car," which was the R1 MG that was so famous. And that's one of the Miles stories, how I got that car. Palm Springs one year, as you remember, Bill, the course was laid out with 2 straightaways, pit straightaway and a back straight,
Right.
and some turns on the corners. And Ken and I were in that race in the under 1500 main event. And I could see Ken going down the back straight when I was going down the pit straight. He was a full half of the racetrack ahead of me. And the track kind of narrowed, and I could see him waving me, come on, you know. So he slowed down evidently, and I kept catching him, and the crowd was screaming, and the announcer was making a big deal out of me catching Miles. We finally got together, and I put my left front wheel right up on his right rear wheel, and we just went round and round like that, and it was everybody screaming and jumping up and down in the corners, and it was really exciting. But only Ken and I knew what was happening, because he could have just left me at any time. He was so quick, and as quick as you'd go, Ken could always go quicker. You'd go out and practice and turn some hot laps and think you were doing very well. Ken would go out and turn 2 seconds a lap quicker than you could. And he drove as fast as he had to drive to win. That was one Miles story that I'll never forget. That's the second one. But we had a lot of interesting times. There were a lot of good people. Here it is, almost 50 years later. Well, it is 50 years later, and we're still friends. I still see Bill socially, and we have a group that meets occasionally 2 or 3 times a year. And it's amazing that we put together 75 or 100 people that were all active in the early 50s in the sports car movement. And it's really been one of the good parts of my life. And very happy that I did it. There were, I guess I drove about 50 or 60 races from 1953 through 57, and had top 3 finishes in about half of them, always behind Ken. I beat him 2 or 3 times, which was always flukes of some kind, because I was never as quick as he was. And I had an Oscar at one time. I think Bill remembers that, Palm Springs in, what year was that? About 1955. I had an MT4 Oscar, and I was driving my MG. The Oscar was brand new, not new, but new to me. I'd never driven it. And I was driving a Bristol Special that Roseanne Engineering in Newport Beach built.
I remember that car.
I drove that car for about a year. Never finished a race with it. Something always fell off of it. Sump plug would fall off. The distributor would fall off.
And Roseanne, if I could interrupt you, they were in the fastening business.
Right. They had the Roseanne Aircraft Fastener Company.
Nothing was supposed to come loose.
And it wasn't Emil Dietz.
Oh, the mechanic?
Yeah, it was, I forget who it was that built the car for Joey Roseanne.
Yeah, I don't remember.
And then they had me driving it. And it was a lot of fun to drive. It had a little more horsepower than anything I had driven. But it was just one of those hard luck cars that never finished anything. And it was no fault of mine, I don't think, because it was just poor preparation. It was a good lesson to learn. And getting back to the Oscars, Sam Hanks had just won Indianapolis. And Sam was at the race as a spectator, actually. And he came and he said, Cy, he says, mind if I drive that little Oscar and practice? I said, no, Sam, great. Go ahead, drive it. So we were out in practice, and I was in this 2-liter Bristol. And look in the mirror going down the back straight, and I figure I'm going pretty quick, and here comes my Oscar, catching me and passes me, going into the last corner at the end of the straightaway. And it's Sam driving my Oscar, hell-bent for going. And as we get to the end of the straightaway, he downshifted, and I'm ducking. There's transmission pieces and parts and stuff and flying at me. And Sam pulled around into the pits, and I pulled in behind him, and I said, Sam, what happened? He said, something broke. And I don't know whether something broke or he missed a shift or whatever happened. But then we fought that car for another year and really never could get it. It had been a factory race car, and they had detuned it and taken all the good stuff out of it before I got it. which was standard practice in those days.
Was that the car that Randall McDougal had by any chance?
No. McDougal had one, and Capel had one, Chick Leeson had one.
They were pretty.
They were very pretty cars, a little four-cylinder that was really put together beautifully. There were no gaskets in the engine. Every nut and bolt was numbered, handmade. The apprentices at the Oscar plant did that. They were the Maserati brothers.
That's what I thought, yeah.
And when they got out of Maserati, they started Oscar. And, played with that car for a while. But in those days, those cars today are worth $250,000. And I think I sold that car for $3,000 or $4,000. They were. So there has been a little inflation.
Just a touch.
But another event that I remember is we did a endurance race at Torrey Pines, and Ken Miles and I had.
When was that?
That was in '55, and Ken and I had an MGA. They were. Goff Industries owned the car, and Ken worked at Goff Industries, who was the distributor of MG at the time. And Ken and I co-drove that car in I don't remember, it was a 6-hour race or a 12-hour race or something.
I think.
And, when you start thinking back on all the good times, there were never really any bad times. It was not just a party, but it was a lot of camaraderie, and everyone enjoyed everyone else. It was a very tight-knit group of people.
Well, it was amateur, for one thing.
That's right. Well, but today, it's changed a lot. In those early days, Jim Kimberly would show up with a trailer and a tractor and a couple of cars and spare motors and spares.
And a movie star.
And a movie star. And Briggs Cunningham and Hastings Harcourt and a lot of very wealthy guys would show up and come to California, and people like Bill would clean their cork. We had Carroll Shelby and Bill and Phil Hill, Dan Gurney, and all these big, wealthy, well-funded race car teams would come here, and they just couldn't touch the California guys. It was really a standard joke at that time. But this went on for, until, I guess we were at Pebble Beach when Ernie McAfee unfortunately got killed. And I was on the track at the time. And in those days,
Yeah, I was too.
the people that weren't funded well, like I was running on recap tires, a lot of used parts, just, on very short budget. It didn't cost a whole lot of money, but none of us had any money. And Ernie McAfee was driving for Bill Doheny, and after he got killed, it just kind of took the starch out of me. I just, instead of running first, second, or third, which I had done for 4 or 5 years, I started running in the 10th and the 15th in the back of the pack. And I just decided that it was just time to quit. And that's when I got out of it. But it was one of the really good times of my life. I think now I'm spending, there's about 10 races a year that my son enters, and I go with him to every event and try to help him along, and he's been doing very well. And it's a generational thing. He's putting his son, my grandson, into a go-kart this year. And we'll see if it carries on. But other than that, Bill, I haven't got a whole lot to say about except maybe the time I drove the motorcycle into the swimming pool at the Miramar in Santa Barbara, and it was race headquarters, down the stairs, out of the bar, into the swimming pool.
Was that the Miramar?
Right, the Miramar, right on 101.
Was that the Jimmy Dean party, or was it?
I don't remember every race was a party.
Yeah, we definitely some fierce parties.
And, you know, Trader Vic used to come from San Francisco down to Pebble Beach and set up a luncheon for us. I guess Trader Vic was a fan, a race car fan, and he would feed us all lunchtime on race days.
He put up a tent.
Right. Tent and a large buffet table. And
bring down a whole cast and crew.
But there, you know, some of the great races that we ran, the Goleta Airport in Santa Barbara was very close proximity to us, and one of the races that we all wound up in. Pebble Beach was a little further away. But I did most of the California races. Stead Air Force Base in Reno, and I didn't get much further than San Francisco. I didn't do any of the Oregon or Washington races. And strangely enough, there's still...
Did you ever get back east to any of those?
No, I never drove in the east. I drove at... I went to Sebring one year as a participant, and my car didn't arrive. I told you that story.
Yeah.
I went with...
I just raced there once myself.
There were 4 Porsche 550s that were coming from Germany, and Ken had one, I had one, John Pierre Kunstel had one, and Richie Ginther had the 4th one. Only 2 of them showed up. Plane lands in Miami and 2 cars. Where are the other 2? Well, they'll be here. Don't worry. They'll be here. Okay. And I was driving a rental Hertz Chevrolet, which I took out and went around Sebring and destroyed that car. There wasn't a tire left on it or a brake one when we got finished. We turned it into the airport in Florida. And they kind of looked at us a little strange.
Told them they should be ashamed to rent a car like that.
A car in this condition.
Yeah, Sebring was a lot of fun. I was there once with Lance. But now you're one of the few people that really was close to Ken Miles, and you know, he got very active in a lot of.
Ken was, I think, except for you, Bill, and Phil, was the premier driver of the time.
Yeah.
But he could drive anything. I mean, little cars, big cars. You put him in any car and he was quick.
Wasn't he a tank driver with a British?
He was a tank retriever. They would go out with a tractor trailer of some kind, and when tanks got disabled, they would bring him back on this.
Oh, okay.
They'd go right into the fighting and drag these tanks out. And then he came here, and he had a wonderful wife, Molly, and son, Peter. Peter is still around. We see each other occasionally. He's still involved in motor racing. He was with Toyota for a long time in their off-road racing.
As a driver?
Not as a driver, as a mechanic or crew member of some kind. And 3 or 4 years ago, Phil Hill said to me, "I'd sure like to get my son Derek into a car." I said, "Well, that's no problem. We'll put him in a car." So I went out and bought a Ferrari, a 348, and we put Derek in that car, and he wound up winning the Ferrari Challenge. And then he went on to Europe for the runoff of all the European challenge groups and won that. He ran yesterday in Brazil, and I haven't found out what happened with Derek there. He's running Formula 3000 as a pre-race for all the Formula One races around the world this year. So this is the breakthrough year for Derek, who I, kind of shepherd Phil's down there with him this weekend. But it's just been a really good part of my life, and I'm glad I did every bit of it. The only thing I'm sorry about is I didn't keep every one of the cars.
I'm sorry you didn't. I'm sorry you didn't.
And it was a little, Bill drove the famous car for a long time, the Carston's Allard. He's Mr. Pebble Beach. And I really don't know what more I can. There's one race I remember at Hanson Dam.
I'm curious, when you were running the R1 car, did you get a lot of help from Goff Industries?
No, we didn't.
Really? I would think they'd be standing there with a parts basket, and
No, Ken, no money. There never was any money. They sponsored Ken, I'm sure, and paid for everything. But we did get some experimental parts from the factory, some pistons and some cams, which Bud Hand put in our car. And then they came out with the twin cam just after I stopped racing, or we probably would have put a twin cam in that car. The cars are both now, the R1 and the Shingle are both up in the Washington area. Pat Hart has both of them. And they've been completely restored, and they don't race them, but it's part of a museum that Pat has. I tried to buy the car back about 10 years ago from Pat, and there was just no price. I mean, he wouldn't even give a price. It
Really?
was just not for sale.
amazing. Well, those were really, as you say, they were wonderful times. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that it was an emerging sport, that nobody had ever done anything like this before. It was all brand new and exciting, and the spectators were enthusiastic about it, that this was they'd seen oval tracks, and that was about it.
That you mentioned that you saw Jack McAfee a few days ago. I'll never forget it, that I was driving this little 90 cubic inch 1500 cc car, and Jack was driving a big Ferrari of some kind at Bakersfield, and it was a tight little course, and Jack would go roaring by down the straightaways and back off in the corners, and you could catch him in the corners and sometimes pass him in the corners. We're rolling down the straightaway. I had just passed him in a corner, and I looked over, and here comes this big Ferrari. And he looked over at me and just went like this, and I just went right on the road. He just faked me out completely. That was the end of my day at Bakersfield.
Who was that? Was that Jack?
Jack.
Oh, a rat.
But it was all in good fun.
You mentioned Hanson Dam.
Yeah.
That was kind of a very rare race, and
It was
only
kind of
ran
a-
once or twice. Didn't
I
it?
think once.
Once. L.A. Orphanage or something like that. In fact, Bill Doheny's wife was very big in it.
I think that was the deal. And I have a picture of Ernie and I on the front of the grid, because I was the quickest little car and he was the quickest big car. And it was a tight little racetrack. And
Yeah.
the little cars were quicker than the big ones. Everything has changed. Most
of a
of these
dangerous-
cars have been modified now. As I say, I was in Laguna Seca until last night. And, cars have got big tires and big brakes and things that we never thought of. They've all been modified. The horsepowers are just outlandish.
Yeah,
They try to keep them as original as possible. And the historics that Steve Earle and Chris Vandegrift put on every year in August, which Bill and I don't think I've missed one in the last 40 years, the August in Pebble Beach. And it's very well done. They get about 300 entries at Laguna Seca. It's very difficult to get a car in. It has to have some history or be a very authentic early 50 car. Just having a 1950 car won't get you in. It has to be a car that was raced and has some history behind it. And it's really some of the fellows that Bill and I raced with. They're still very active. Pete Lovely races there every year.
Right.
There's still 4 or 5 guys that are still very, very active in the sport.
It's pretty scary, though. A couple of years ago, I went back and raced the old Allard that Dave Brodsky had restored, and it was, like time travel, and going back 30 or 40 years driving a car that at that time seemed like the last word in engineering was a frightening experience.
Well, I think, Bill, the fellows that are still driving that drove when we did are fellows that never stopped.
That's true.
If you continued year after year driving, your skills stayed sharp, you grew with the cars, with the speed. The cars are much quicker now than we ever drove.
Well, you got used to some of the idiosyncrasies of the car, too.
And the ones that stayed and raced 3 or 4 times a year or more every year since the 50s are the fellows that are still in it. For us to go, I get offered cars. My son keeps saying, "Get in the car, Dad, get in the car, drive it." I just have no desire to anymore. I know my limitations, and I don't want to go out there and do battle with those guys. So maybe, I don't know how Bill feels, but
Well, it's
you get to be 74 years old, it's time to get out of it. But then again, Phil Hill, he still runs. Pete Lovely still runs.
but it's pretty frightening, particularly on Laguna Seca, which is I think a challenging circuit. It has some reverse camber and downhill that is very unsettling. You feel very insecure or I do anyhow, on a reverse camber turn where you're the car wants to throw you out of the car.
Well, the thing that gets me at Laguna Seca is you come up over a rise, you don't know what's over there.
That's true.
And you go up a hill, up to the corkscrew, and there's just blue sky out there, and then it just drops. And if you're not set up right for that corner, you're history. So.
Yeah, but it's like you say, the not knowing what's over the rise too. There could be somebody sideways in the road, and
Well, the flag marshals are there to tell you about that, but
yeah, right. But now you're relying on somebody else, which has always been a little iffy for me. He might be looking away at the moment something occurs.
That's true.
He's not supposed to, but he's human. But we had some of the circuits that we raced. You like Santa Barbara, would you mention?
I liked Santa Barbara. I liked Torrey Pines was great.
I love Torrey Pines.
And then Pebble Beach was always the cap of the year. You'd run at Pebble Beach, that was the big deal.
Yeah, that was like the Indianapolis of sports car racing.
And people would come from all over the country. And they had the concourse there at Pebble Beach and most of the race cars would wind up on the lawn at Pebble Beach for the concours. But today, the concours has gotten so huge, and Steve Earle has Laguna Seca, which brings 50 or 60,000 people to the racetrack. At like $75 for a 3-day ticket. And I don't know what they're getting today for the Pebble Beach Concours, but
$50.
50, and they get 30 or 40,000. They get more people than they can handle.
Yeah.
And you can't even see the cars, and they just get thousands and thousands of people in there. And people are very cognizant of those cars that we drove, and you know, the country is in very good shape. People have made a lot of money, and it seems like guys my age and Bill's age that were not in the sport, that could stand by the fence and watch us go around, today, those are the guys that are resurrecting all these old race cars, something they couldn't have when they were kids. It's the same thing as, you know, 57 Fords and 41 Ford convertibles, and you see 75 and 80-year-old men driving around in those cars, and that's the car they lusted after when they were a kid, and now they're in a position to have one. So they go right back and get one.
So true, so true. And it's kind of a retro period in our history. We see it in new car styling with a lot of new cars that are very extremely popular are in retro, but also in music. There's a resurgence of old jazz and other that, you know, all of a sudden it's become the thing. My grandchildren are into the modern jazz quartet, you know, and jazz that I loved back in the when I was their age, or a little older. You said you mentioned Palm Springs, and did you ever get up to Madera? Did you ever race up there?
No, I never did. I did Salinas. Actually, my wife and I were trailering to Salinas, and Jim Dean passed us in his Porsche Spider.
You're talking about Jimmy Dean,
Jimmy Dean, the actor.
yeah.
And we got about 50 miles on down the road, and there was a big, horrendous crash there. And I just drove around and kept going. There were ambulances and police, and had no idea that it was Dean until the next day when we heard what had happened. But it was never a very dangerous sport, even though we didn't have the right equipment. We had a leather helmet, which was a Cromwell from England. It was kind of a polo helmet that if you ever needed it, it would have been worthless.
A joke.
No fire clothing, no.
Pirelli driving suits finally came in, which were beautiful looking and would probably burst into flame.
It would be like kids' cotton pajamas is what they were. All the cars today are equipped with fuel cells. You can drop one of these gas tanks off a 5-story building and it won't leak. We didn't have all those luxuries.
We didn't have roll bars.
No roll bars, no shoulder
harness.
harnesses,
Yeah.
no safety equipment to speak of at all, but there were very little injuries.
Don't you remember when we first, you know, we were putting safety belts in cars, the Europeans didn't believe in safety
No.
belts.
They always felt they'd rather be out of the car when it crashed, be thrown out of it, than stay in it. And I think that was from fire danger.
Yeah.
They were always afraid of fire.
But even the use of safety belts, the ones that we had were.
Well, Chick Vandegrift was a big driver of safety.
Uh-huh.
And he is the one that really forced seat belts in all the sports cars, as I recall.
But the only seat belts I had Army surplus aircraft.
We all did.
Belts. That was it.
It was about a 4-inch wide.
Yeah, that was it.
Army airplane seat belt is what
Exactly,
it was, with a big
yeah.
leather pad and a toggle.
Yeah. But nothing up here, nothing to stop you up here. Well,
I haven't got a lot more to add, Bill.
I think we'll wind it up then. Thanks very much, Cy.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
you coming down.
Thank you, Bill.